The blood spattered across Lieutenant Emma Reese's uniform told a different story than the one in her report. Major William Hayes stared at her with unveiled contempt, his thick fingers drumming against her medical evaluation as if each tap could somehow change the words on the page. Exhaustion? Heat stroke? His voice dripped with sarcasm. You expect me to believe that's why your platoon failed to secure their objective? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma stood at rigid attention, her eyes fixed on a point just above the major's head. She'd been back from Afghanistan for exactly 48 hours, and the memories of what happened in the Korengal Valley were still raw enough that she could taste copper in her mouth whenever she closed her eyes. Sir, as stated in my report, extreme environmental conditions compromised our operational effectiveness. I take full responsibility for the mission's outcome. Hayes laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through his office like breaking glass. Environmental conditions? Is that what they're calling cowardice these days at West Point? Emma felt her jaw tighten but maintained her composure. The room seemed to shrink around her as the major rose from behind his desk, his 6'2" frame towering over her 5'6" stature. You're the first female combat officer assigned to my battalion, Lieutenant, he said, circling her like a predator. And I warned Colonel Richards that this would happen. Women don't have the physical or psychological fortitude for frontline combat. Your little episode just proves my point. Emma's throat constricted. Sir, with all due respect, you don't get to speak of respect. Hayes cut her off, slamming the report down. Not when your weakness put 12 good men at risk. You'll face a formal review board next week. Until then, you're confined to administrative duties. She stood perfectly still as he dismissed her with a contemptuous flick of his wrist. Every step toward the door required conscious effort, her body remembering injuries her uniform now concealed. The battalion headquarters buzzed with the controlled chaos of a combat unit preparing for deployment. Emma felt eyes following her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few openly hostile. News traveled fast in a tight-knit unit like the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the whispers about her breakdown in Afghanistan had already taken on a life of their own. Lieutenant Reese. Emma turned to find Captain Sarah Mitchell jogging to catch up with her. Mitchell was one of the few female officers in the battalion, serving as the intelligence officer for their regiment. I heard about your meeting with Hayes, Mitchell said quietly, falling into step beside her. He's a dinosaur, Emma. Don't let him get to you. Emma's laugh held no humor. Too late for that. Mitchell studied her face with the intensity of someone trained to notice details others missed. Something happened out there that's not in your report, didn't it? Emma stopped walking, her gaze drifting to the window where soldiers ran drills under the merciless Georgia sun. Fort Benning looked nothing like the mountains of Afghanistan. Yet suddenly she was back there, the sound of gunfire, the smell of dust and blood, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. I followed protocol, Emma finally said. That's all that matters. Mitchell frowned. Emma, you've been back 2 days and you look like you haven't slept in a month. Have you talked to anyone about what happened? And say what? That I'm too weak for combat, just like Hayes believes? Emma shook her head. I'll be fine. Before Mitchell could respond, a booming voice called out from across the corridor. Lieutenant Reese, a word. Command Sergeant Major Frank Ortiz approached with the measured stride of a man who'd spent 30 years in uniform. Unlike Hayes, Ortiz's reputation was built on fairness and a fierce commitment to his soldiers, regardless of gender. Walk with me, he said, not waiting for a response. Emma followed him outside, where the humid air clung to her skin like a second uniform. They walked in silence until they reached a secluded bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. I read your report, Ortiz said finally. And I also read the separate statements from your platoon sergeant and your medic. Emma's pulse quickened. Sir? Their accounts don't match yours. Ortiz's weathered face revealed nothing. They mentioned details you conveniently left out, like the sniper fire you drew away from your wounded men, and the 8 clicks you carried Private Rodriguez after the IED took out his leg. Emma stared at her hands. They were just doing their job, sir. As was I. That's not how they tell it. Ortiz leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What I can't figure out is why you'd file a report that makes it sound like you had some kind of breakdown when the truth is you saved those men. Emma swallowed hard. Because it doesn't matter, sir. Not to people like Major Hayes. Explain. She met his gaze directly for the first time. If I reported that I sustained injuries while carrying Rodriguez, Hayes would say I wasn't strong enough for the mission. If I mentioned drawing sniper fire, he'd say I made a tactical error that put my men at risk in the first place. There was no version of events where my actions would be judged by the same standards as a male officer's. Ortiz absorbed this with a slight nod. So you took the fall, knowing Hayes would use it to prove his point about women in combat. Better me than setting back every other woman trying to serve in frontline positions, Emma replied. This is bigger than my career. The sergeant major studied her with eyes that had seen decades of warfare. You're scheduled for a physical tomorrow. Standard procedure after returning from deployment. Emma tensed. Yes, sir. Don't skip it, he said, rising to his feet. That's an order, Lieutenant. As he walked away, Emma felt the weight of what tomorrow would bring. The military doctor would document everything, the still healing lacerations on her back from dragging Rodriguez through rocky terrain, the cracked ribs from when she'd used her body to shield Spencer from falling debris, the burn marks on her arms from pulling Taylor from the destroyed Humvee. Her body told the story her report didn't, and by this time tomorrow, that story would be in her official medical record. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night in her small on-base housing unit, Emma stood before her bathroom mirror and slowly removed her uniform. Each button felt like a confession, each layer revealing more of the truth she'd tried to hide. When she finally stood in just her underwear, the full extent of her sacrifice was mapped across her skin in vivid detail. The mirror reflected a battlefield written in bruises and half-healed wounds. Her back was a canvas of angry red scrapes and purple contusions from dragging Rodriguez to safety. Her ribs were wrapped in medical tape, still tender from the impact of sheltering Spencer. The burns on her forearms were glossy and pink, souvenirs from reaching into the flaming Humvee for Taylor. Emma traced the largest scar, a jagged line that ran from her left shoulder down toward her elbow, the result of shielding Davis from shrapnel when they'd been pinned down by enemy fire. 13 stitches had closed the wound, but the doctor in Afghanistan had warned it would leave a permanent mark. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call, the screen lighting up with her mother's name. Emma let it ring. How could she explain any of this to her family? Her mother had been so proud when Emma had graduated from West Point, the first in their family to become an officer. How could she tell her that the same institution she'd worked so hard to join was now determined to prove she didn't belong? Sleep came in broken fragments that night, interrupted by the same nightmares that had haunted her since Afghanistan. In them, she was always running desperately trying to reach her men as invisible forces held her back. She would wake gasping for air, the phantom weight of Rodriguez still pressing against her shoulders, the imagined heat of the burning Humvee singeing her skin. Morning arrived with harsh fluorescent light and the antiseptic smell of the base medical center. Emma sat on the examination table in a thin paper gown, acutely aware of how exposed she was in every sense of the word. Lieutenant Reese? Dr. Carolyn Winters entered with a clipboard and a practiced smile. I'm conducting your post-deployment physical today. Emma nodded stiffly. Yes, ma'am. Dr. Winters was in her 50s, with silver streaks in her dark hair and the confident manner of someone who'd treated soldiers for decades. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she noted Emma's guarded posture. I need you to remove the gown for the examination, she said, setting down her clipboard. Standard procedure. Emma hesitated before slowly lowering the gown. She heard Dr. Winters' sharp intake of breath. Lieutenant, these injuries. The doctor's professional demeanor faltered. None of this is documented in your medical report from the field hospital. I decline detailed documentation, Emma admitted. I received necessary treatment, but requested they keep the records minimal. Dr. Winters' expression hardened. That's against protocol, and you know it. These injuries are extensive. The burn marks alone should have warranted evacuation. Emma met her gaze steadily. My men needed me. And now they need you to tell the truth. Dr. Winters began methodically examining each injury, making detailed notes. The medical record doesn't lie, Lieutenant. And your body is telling a very different story than your official report. By the time the examination ended, Dr. Winters had documented 17 distinct injuries, from the major traumas to the smaller cuts and bruises that told the story of a soldier who had pushed her body well beyond its limits. I'm obligated to file this with your command, Dr. Winters said as Emma redressed. These findings directly contradict your official account. Emma buttoned her uniform jacket with steady hands. I understand. Do you? The doctor's voice softened. Because from where I'm standing, you deliberately concealed injuries sustained in combat. That's not just against protocol, it's potentially career-ending. It was my choice, Emma replied. Dr. Winters shook her head. No, Lieutenant. The choice to serve your country shouldn't come with the burden of hiding your sacrifice. That defeats the entire purpose. Emma left the medical center feeling strangely lighter, as if sharing the physical evidence of her experience had somehow lessened its weight. The reckoning she'd feared was coming, but there was an unexpected relief in no longer carrying the lie. That afternoon, Emma was summoned to Colonel Richard's office, the battalion commander and Major Hayes' direct superior. She arrived to find not only the colonel and Hayes, but also Command Sergeant Major Ortiz and Dr. Winters. Lieutenant Reese, Colonel Richards began, his expression unreadable. We have a significant discrepancy to address. Major Hayes looked smug, arms crossed over his broad chest. Your medical evaluation directly contradicts your official report, Lieutenant. This kind of deception could be grounds for dismissal from service. Emma stood at attention, eyes forward. Yes, sir. Before we continue, Colonel Richards said, I'd like to hear from Dr. Winters. The doctor stepped forward, medical file in hand. Lieutenant Reese's injuries are extensive and consistent with intense combat activity and life-saving measures. The burns on her arms match the pattern typically seen when extracting personnel from a burning vehicle. The lacerations on her back are consistent with dragging a heavy weight across rough terrain. The contusions on her ribs indicate blunt force trauma, likely from impact or deliberate shielding of another person. She paused, making eye contact with each officer in the room. In my professional opinion, these injuries tell the story of a soldier who repeatedly put herself at extreme physical risk to save her comrades. Major Hayes scoffed. Or they show a soldier who couldn't handle the physical demands of combat and injured herself through incompetence. That's enough, Major, Colonel Richards said sharply. Sergeant Major Ortiz cleared his throat. With your permission, sir, I've brought someone who can clarify matters. At his nod, the door opened to reveal Sergeant James Davis, one of the men from Emma's platoon. His left arm was in a sling, but he stood straight as he entered, saluting crisply. Sergeant Davis, the colonel acknowledged. I understand you were present during the incident in question. Yes, sir. Davis glanced at Emma, his expression resolute. Lieutenant Reese saved my life, sir. And not just mine. Explain, Colonel Richards ordered. Davis took a deep breath. We were conducting a patrol through the Korengal Valley when we were ambushed from 3 positions. The first IED took out our point man, Rodriguez, severing his right leg below the knee. Lieutenant Reese applied a tourniquet while under direct fire, then carried him nearly 8 kilometers to the extraction point. Major Hayes interrupted. That's physically impossible. Rodriguez weighs at least 180 pounds with his gear. With respect, sir, I saw it with my own eyes, Davis continued firmly. When our Humvee was hit, she pulled Taylor out through flames that burned through her uniform. When the building we were using for cover started to collapse, she used her body to shield Spencer from falling debris. He looked directly at Emma, his voice thick with emotion. And when I was hit by shrapnel, she covered my body with hers and took a piece of metal that was meant for my chest. That's how she got the scar on her shoulder. The room fell silent. Emma felt exposed in a way that the medical examination hadn't prepared her for her actions laid bare, not just as physical evidence, but as testimony from one of her own men. Why did you file a false report, Lieutenant? Colonel Richards asked quietly. Emma hesitated, acutely aware of Hayes' glare. I believed it would be better for the unit and for future female combat officers if my difficulties were attributed to environmental factors rather than gender-specific limitations. So you lied, Hayes pressed. I omitted details that I feared would be used to question the capability of all female officers, sir, Emma corrected. I was willing to accept personal consequences to protect the progress we've made in integration. Colonel Richards studied her thoughtfully. You were willing to sacrifice your career to prevent your actions from being used as evidence against women in combat roles. Yes, sir. Sergeant Major Ortiz stepped forward. Sir, Lieutenant Reese's platoon has submitted individual statements detailing her actions during the mission. I've collected 12 separate accounts, all corroborating what Sergeant Davis has shared. He handed a folder to the colonel, who skimmed its contents with a deepening frown. Major Hayes, the colonel said finally, did you review these statements before recommending disciplinary action against Lieutenant Reese? Hayes shifted uncomfortably. I focused on the official report, sir, which directly contradicted the eyewitness accounts of 12 combat veterans, Colonel Richards noted. Did that not strike you as unusual enough to warrant further investigation? The major's face flushed. Sir, I believed the men might be trying to protect their platoon leader. Or perhaps, Sergeant Major Ortiz interrupted, you saw an opportunity to support your preconceived notions about female combat officers, regardless of the evidence. The tension in the room was palpable as Colonel Richards closed the folder. Lieutenant Reese, your actions in combat demonstrate exceptional courage and leadership. However, your decision to falsify an official report, regardless of intention, cannot be overlooked. Emma nodded, prepared for the consequences. You will submit a corrected report immediately, including all details previously omitted, the colonel continued. You will also accept a formal reprimand for violating reporting protocols. That said, based on the evidence before me and the testimony of your men, I am recommending you for the Silver Star for valor in combat. Emma's head snapped up in shock. Sir? Your willingness to sacrifice yourself both physically in combat and professionally afterward speaks to the highest traditions of military service, Colonel Richards said. That kind of leadership deserves recognition, not punishment. He turned to Major Hayes. As for you, Major, we will discuss your handling of this matter privately. Dismissed. As they filed out of the office, Emma found herself face to face with Sergeant Davis in the hallway. His eyes held a mixture of respect and concern. You should have told the truth from the beginning, Lieutenant, he said quietly. We were never going to let you fall on that sword alone. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. I didn't want what happened to become ammunition for people like Hayes, Davis smiled slightly. With all due respect, ma'am, you carried Rodriguez for 8 clicks with 3 cracked ribs. If that doesn't prove women can handle combat, I don't know what does. Later that evening, as Emma sat in her quarters rewriting her report, this time including every painful, triumphant detail, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Captain Mitchell standing there with a small paper bag. "I brought whiskey," Mitchell said by way of greeting. "Figured you could use it after today." Emma let her in, clearing space on her small table for 2 glasses. "News travels fast, especially when it involves Major Hayes getting chewed out by the colonel," Mitchell replied, pouring amber liquid into each glass. "Half the battalion is talking about how you carried Rodriguez through the mountains with broken ribs." Emma winced. "It's being exaggerated." "Is it?" Mitchell handed her a glass. "Because your medical report suggests otherwise." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the whiskey burning pleasantly as Emma considered how quickly her carefully constructed narrative had unraveled. "I thought I was protecting something bigger than myself," she admitted finally. Mitchell nodded. "You were. But sometimes the most powerful statement is simply the unvarnished truth." She raised her glass. "To telling our own stories, scars and all." Emma clinked her glass against Mitchell's, feeling for the first time since returning home that perhaps the truth, painful, complicated, and beautiful in its rawness, was indeed enough. The following week brought the formal review board that Hayes had originally scheduled to question Emma's fitness for command. Instead, it became a venue for recognizing her actions, with her corrected report serving as the foundation for her Silver Star recommendation. One by one, the men from her platoon testified about what they had witnessed in that valley, not a woman failing under pressure, but a leader who had repeatedly risked her life to save theirs. Rodriguez, still recovering in Walter Reed Medical Center, joined by video conference to describe how Emma had carried him to safety despite her own injuries. "I don't remember much after the IED," he said, his young face solemn on the screen. "But I remember Lieutenant Reese telling me I was going home to see my daughter be born. She kept talking to me the whole way, even when I could feel her struggling to breathe. She never stopped, not once in those 8 kilometers. By the time the review concluded, even the most skeptical officers on the board had fallen silent, confronted with evidence that defied their expectations. The narrative Hayes had tried to construct of female weakness and incompetence had crumbled beneath the weight of 12 consistent accounts and Emma's battle-scarred body. Outside the hearing room, Sergeant Major Ortiz caught up with Emma as she headed back to her quarters. "You know, Lieutenant," he said, falling into step beside her, "in 30 years of service, I've learned that the true measure of a soldier isn't how they perform when everything goes according to plan. It's what they do when everything falls apart." Emma considered this. "I just did what anyone would have done, Sergeant Major." Ortiz laughed, a genuine, warm sound that contrasted with his usual gruffness. "No, Lieutenant. You did what a leader does. And in doing so, you've made it a little harder for the next Hayes to dismiss a soldier based on gender rather than merit." As she continued toward her quarters, Emma passed the battalion's training grounds, where a new group of lieutenants, including 3 women, were preparing for their first deployment. They watched her with curious eyes, already having heard the stories that were spreading throughout the base. One of the female lieutenants, a petite woman with determined eyes, straightened as Emma approached. "Lieutenant Reese, I just wanted to say thank you for showing what's possible." Emma stopped, really seeing the young officer and her companions, the next generation who would build upon whatever foundation she and others like her established. "The scars are worth it," Emma said quietly, touching the hidden mark on her shoulder. "Remember that when things get difficult, every battle you fight makes it easier for the ones who come after you." That night, Emma finally called her mother, ready to share the full story of what had happened in Afghanistan, not the sanitized version she'd originally crafted, but the messy, painful truth with all its complexity and triumph. As she spoke, tracing the now familiar path of scars that mapped her sacrifice, Emma understood that the greatest victory wasn't surviving the ambush or carrying Rodriguez to safety or even earning the Silver Star. It was claiming the right to tell her own story, without apology or diminishment. The truth, it turned out, was a weapon more powerful than any she had carried into combat, and far more difficult for people like Hayes to dismiss. 6 months after the events that had earned her the Silver Star, Lieutenant Emma Reese stood on the tarmac at Bagram Airfield, watching as a C-17 Globemaster touched down in a swirl of Afghan dust. The massive transport plane carried her platoon and the weight of expectations that now shadowed her every move. The story of what happened in the Korengal Valley had taken on a life of its own, spreading through military channels with the efficiency of a well-executed operation. Some versions painted her as a superhuman warrior who had carried a man twice, her size through enemy territory without breaking a sweat. Others emphasized the political implications, how her actions had silenced critics of women in combat roles, at least temporarily. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between these extremes. Emma had simply done what the moment demanded, making split-second decisions that prioritized the lives of her soldiers over her own safety. The mythology that had grown around those actions sometimes felt like a burden heavier than Rodriguez had been that day. Lieutenant Reese, the voice of her new platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun, broke through her thoughts. "The men are ready for briefing." Emma nodded, turning away from the runway. "Thank you, Sergeant. Let's not keep them waiting." This deployment was different from her first in countless ways. She was no longer the unproven female officer with something to prove now. She was that lieutenant who had earned a Silver Star and the grudging respect of even the most traditional corners of the military. The pressure to live up to her own legend was immense. Inside the briefing tent, 24 Rangers stood at attention her new platoon, assigned to her after her recovery period stateside. Most were veterans of multiple deployments, their faces weathered by sun and experience. A few were fresh from Ranger School, their uniforms still stiff with newness. All of them watched her with the same mixture of curiosity and assessment. "At ease," Emma said, moving to the front of the room. "I know most of you have heard stories about me and what happened 6 months ago. Whatever version reached you, I suggest you forget it." A ripple of surprise moved through the group. "Our mission here isn't about living up to legends or proving points," she continued. "It's about executing our objectives and getting everyone home alive. That's the only measure of success that matters." As she outlined their first operation, a reconnaissance mission in Helmand Province, Emma noted the skepticism in some faces and the open admiration in others. Neither reaction was helpful. Both created barriers between her and the men she needed to lead effectively. After the briefing, Sergeant Chun approached her as the platoon filed out. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am." "Always, Sergeant." Chun had served 12 years, with 4 combat deployments under his belt. His reputation as a straight shooter had been one of the reasons Emma had requested him as her platoon sergeant. "They're going to test you," he said bluntly. "Not because you're a woman, though that's part of it for some, but because of the medal. They need to know if you're the real deal or just someone who got lucky once and rode it to glory." Emma appreciated his candor. "I'm counting on you to help me show them the difference." The next morning found them moving through the pre-dawn darkness of Helmand Province, their mission to gather intelligence on suspected Taliban movements near a remote village. Emma had positioned herself in the middle of the formation, close enough to maintain command and control, but not so far forward that it suggested she was trying to prove something. 4 hours into the patrol, Private First Class Wilson, one of the newer Rangers, stumbled on the uneven terrain, twisting his ankle badly enough that continuing became questionable. "I can keep going, ma'am," he insisted, clearly embarrassed as the patrol halted to assess his injury. Emma knelt beside him, noting the swelling already visible through his boot. "Can you?" "Yes, should you?" "That's a different question." She felt the eyes of the platoon on her, measuring her response. Would she push him to continue, proving her toughness? Or evacuate him immediately, showing caution that might be interpreted as weakness? Sergeant Chun splint his ankle. "Wilson, you'll continue with modified gear distribution. Miller and Jackson will split your pack weight, and you'll use your rifle as additional support. We'll reassess at the next checkpoint." It was a middle path, neither recklessly demanding nor overly cautious. Emma saw the slight nod of approval from Chun and the relief in Wilson's eyes. Small moments like these, she knew, would define her leadership more than any dramatic rescue or battlefield heroism. The patrol reached their observation point without further incident, establishing a hidden position overlooking a valley where intelligence suggested Taliban fighters gathered to plan operations. As they settled in for what might be days of watching and waiting, Emma established a rotation that ensured everyone received adequate rest while maintaining vigilance. On the second night, as Emma took her turn at observation, Sergeant Chun joined her, his experienced eyes scanning the darkness. "The men are talking about you," he said quietly. "Should I be concerned?" "No, they're impressed. Not by the Silver Star, though there's that too, but by how you handled Wilson. Most officers they've served under would have either evacuated him immediately to avoid risk, or pushed him to keep going at full capacity to prove a point." Emma continued to watch the valley below through her night vision device. "I'm not interested in proving points, Sergeant. I'm interested in completing our mission without unnecessary casualties." "That's why they're coming around," Chun replied. "You're not what they expected." "And what did they expect?" Chun's silence was telling. Finally he said, "Someone trading on her reputation. Someone with something to prove. Someone who got lucky once and might get them killed trying to repeat it." Emma lowered her device, meeting his gaze directly. "And what do you think, Sergeant?" "I think you've carried heavier weights than Rodriguez," he answered simply. The conversation was interrupted by movement in the valley. Below, 3 vehicles approaching the compound they'd been monitoring. For the next hour, they documented the arrival of what appeared to be a mid-level Taliban commander and his security detail. By dawn, they had gathered valuable intelligence without being detected. As they prepared to extract, Emma felt a subtle shift in how the men responded to her, commands and new efficiency born of growing trust rather than mere obligation. Their return to base was uneventful, but the mission was deemed a success. The intelligence they gathered led to the identification of 3 previously unknown Taliban facilitators operating in the province. More importantly, Emma had begun the process of building the kind of trust with her new platoon that couldn't be awarded with medals or ordered into existence. 2 weeks later, that nascent trust faced its first real test. Their platoon was tasked with providing security for a meeting between local Afghan leaders and American military officials in a village that straddled the contested boundary between government and Taliban influence. The operation began smoothly. Emma positioned her soldiers strategically throughout the village, establishing both visible security presence to reassure the local leaders and hidden observation posts to detect any approaching threats. 3 hours into the meeting, Chun's voice crackled through her radio with the controlled urgency of a veteran sensing danger before it materialized. "Lieutenant, I'm picking up unusual movement patterns in the eastern approach. Civilian traffic has completely stopped in the last 20 minutes. Emma had learned to trust Chun's instincts. "All elements, increase alert status. Possible hostile approach from the east. Maintain discipline and wait for confirmation." She made her way to Chun's position on the roof of a 2-story building that offered the best vantage point of the eastern road. He handed her his binoculars without comment. Through them, Emma could see the empty road stretching toward a series of low hills. The absence of the normal foot traffic and occasional vehicles was indeed suspicious. Could be nothing, Chun offered. Local Taliban sometimes clear areas before moving fighters through. Or before an attack, Emma added. How long until the meeting concludes? At least another hour, ma'am. Emma weighed her options carefully. Calling for an immediate evacuation might unnecessarily damage fragile relationships with the local leaders. Doing nothing might place everyone at risk if Chun's instincts were correct. I want our QRF moved closer to the meeting location, she decided, referring to the quick reaction force they'd positioned on the village outskirts. And get me direct communication with the meeting security team. We don't evacuate yet, but we prepare to do so on short notice. Chun nodded his approval of the measured response. Yes, ma'am. 20 minutes later, Emma's caution proved justified. The distinctive crack of a sniper rifle echoed across the village, followed immediately by the radio call she'd been dreading. Contact east. Single shooter, long range. The bullet had struck the wall of the meeting building, causing panic but no casualties. Emma's preparations now shifted to rapid execution. QRF, secure the meeting participants and prepare for immediate extraction, she ordered. Chun, get a fix on that shooter's position. All observation posts, report any movement immediately. The next 30 minutes unfolded in the controlled chaos of a complex military operation under fire. Emma moved between positions, adjusting security as the meeting participants were evacuated safely to waiting vehicles. She maintained a calm exterior that belied the adrenaline surging through her system, her voice steady as she directed her soldiers' movements. When a second shooter revealed his position from the west, confirming this was a coordinated attack, Emma's response was immediate and decisive. Jackson, establish suppressive fire. Miller, get the counter-sniper team in position. Everyone else, maintain your sectors of fire. The precision of her commands and the confidence in her voice steadied her men as they executed the extraction, under increasingly complex conditions. When Private Wilson, his ankle still not fully healed, found himself exposed to possible fire while covering the last civilians. Evacuation. Emma personally moved to his position, providing additional security until he could reach cover. Ma'am, you shouldn't, Wilson began. Save it, Private, Emma cut him off. Move when I tell you, not before. When the last vehicle cleared the village and her platoon began their own carefully coordinated withdrawal, Emma felt the weight of responsibility as physically as she had felt Rodriguez on her shoulders 6 months earlier. Every decision, every command carried the potential for life or death consequences. Back at Bagram, the after-action review revealed just how close they had come to disaster. Intelligence analysis suggested the attack had been planned to target the specific officials in the meeting, with at least 6 Taliban fighters positioned to converge on the village. Your precautionary measures likely prevented significant casualties, the battalion intelligence officer concluded. By positioning your forces to respond before the attack fully developed, you disrupted their operational timeline. Emma accepted the assessment with professional detachment, but privately she credited Chun's intuition and her platoon's disciplined response more than her own decisions. Later that evening, she found several of her soldiers gathered around a small table in the recreation area, playing cards and unwinding after the day's tension. Their conversation halted awkwardly as she approached. Don't stop on my account, she said, turning to leave them to their downtime. Lieutenant, called Specialist Rivera, one of the more experienced rangers in the platoon. Would you like to join us? The invitation was significant, an extension of the kind of casual camaraderie that formed the backbone of unit cohesion. Emma hesitated only briefly before pulling up a chair. Fair warning, I grew up with 3 brothers who thought poker was a sacred ritual, she said as Rivera dealt her in. For the next hour, she was neither the Silver Star recipient nor the female officer breaking barriers. She was simply another ranger, sharing the dark humor and understated banter that soldiers have used for centuries to process the realities of combat. When Wilson made a joke about his ankle nearly getting them all killed, Emma saw the opportunity to address what had happened directly. "Your position was critical to the extraction, Wilson. You held it exactly as needed." She kept her tone matter-of-fact, neither praising excessively nor diminishing his contribution. Wilson nodded, clearly appreciative of both the acknowledgement and its professional delivery. "Next time I'll try not to need backup from an officer, ma'am." "Next time I expect you won't," Emma agreed, the slight smile softening what might otherwise have sounded like criticism. By the time she left the game deliberately losing her remaining chips to make, her exit natural rather than awkward, something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with these men. The mystique of her previous actions had been replaced by the more valuable currency of demonstrated competence and shared experience. As the weeks passed, Emma's platoon was assigned increasingly complex missions, from night raids on suspected Taliban compounds to extended reconnaissance operations deep in contested territory. Each successful completion built upon the foundation of trust that had begun with that first patrol. 3 months into the deployment, they faced their most significant challenge yet. Intelligence had identified a high-value Taliban facilitator operating from a compound in the mountains near the Pakistan border. Emma's platoon was tasked with the capture or elimination of this target. The operation was planned with meticulous attention to detail. Aerial reconnaissance provided layout of the compound, and informant reports suggested the target would be present with minimal security during a specific 48-hour window. What the intelligence failed to capture was the network of caves and tunnels that connected the main compound to secondary positions in the surrounding mountains, a defensive feature that had protected local villages for centuries against various invaders. Emma's platoon approached the objective in the darkest hours before dawn, using the rugged terrain for concealment. The initial breach of the compound perimeter went exactly as planned, with 2 4-man teams securing the main building while the remainder of the platoon established a security perimeter. When Private Wilson's team became pinned down by particularly effective enemy fire, Emma made a decision that echoed her actions in the Korengal Valley. Rather than directing from a position of relative safety, she moved forward to provide additional firepower where it was most needed. "Miller Rivera with me," she ordered, selecting the 2 soldiers closest to her position. "We're going to flank that northern position and give Wilson's team room to maneuver." The 3 Rangers moved with practiced efficiency, using available cover to approach the enemy position from an unexpected angle. When they were in position, Emma gave the signal to engage, their combined fire temporarily suppressing the Taliban fighters who had trapped Wilson's team. "Wilson, move now," she commanded through the radio. "We've got you covered." As Wilson's team successfully withdrew to better positions, Emma felt the familiar rush of combat clarity, the heightened awareness that seemed to slow time and sharpen every sense. She noticed details that might otherwise have been overlooked, the slight movement behind a rocky outcropping that revealed another enemy position, the pattern of fire that suggested the Taliban were running low on ammunition in certain locations. Using this tactical awareness, she adjusted her platoon's positions and fire distribution, gradually shifting from desperate defense to coordinated withdrawal. When Specialist Rivera was struck by enemy fire, a bullet grazing his shoulder deeply enough to cause concerning blood loss, Emma quickly applied a field dressing while continuing to direct the operation. "It's not bad, ma'am," Rivera insisted, his face pale despite his words. "Good enough to shoot?" Emma asked, completing the bandage with practiced efficiency. "Absolutely. Then I need you covering our 6 as we move to the rally point." She helped him to a protected position before rejoining Chun to coordinate the final phase of their extraction. The withdrawal was executed in textbook fashion, with teams leapfrogging to provide continuous coverage as they moved toward their designated extraction point. Emma insisted on being with the final element, ensuring every one of her soldiers was accounted for before she herself left the engagement area. As their helicopters lifted off Rivera and 2 other wounded secured for medical evacuation, Emma felt the weight of responsibility that came with command. The mission had technically failed, with the target escaping before their arrival. But her platoon had survived a well-executed ambush with only minor casualties, an outcome that spoke to both their training and her leadership. Back at base, the intelligence failure became the focus of intense scrutiny. How had the Taliban known about the operation? Why hadn't aerial reconnaissance detected the cave network? These questions would be answered in the coming days and weeks, but Emma's immediate concern was for her soldiers. She visited Rivera in the medical facility, where doctors assured her his wound was not serious enough to require evacuation to Germany. He would be back with the platoon within weeks. "Thank you for coming, ma'am," he said, sitting up straighter despite the pain it clearly caused him. "The guy said you were the last one on the helicopter." Emma shrugged slightly. "Standard procedure for the platoon leader." Rivera shook his head. "Not all leaders follow that procedure when bullets are flying, Lieutenant." She recognized the deeper meaning behind his words. Her actions had been noticed and evaluated, not just by her superiors, but by the men she led. In the unforgiving meritocracy of combat, she had again proven herself by the standards that mattered most to them. That evening, as she completed her after-action report, detailing both the intelligence failures and her platoon's performance, Emma reflected on how different this experience had been from her first deployment. 6 months ago, she had hidden the truth of her actions, fearing they would be used against her and all women in combat roles. Now she documented her decisions with straightforward honesty, confident they would be judged on their tactical merit rather than as evidence for or against female capabilities. When Chun stopped by her quarters to review the report before submission, his assessment was characteristically direct. "Solid analysis of what went wrong and what we did right," he said, handing back the tablet. "But you left out how you personally moved forward to help extract Wilson's team." Emma considered this. It wasn't relevant to the overall tactical assessment. Chun raised an eyebrow. "With respect, ma'am, it demonstrated the kind of leadership that made the difference between a tactical withdrawal and a potential disaster." After he left, Emma added a brief, factual description of her movement to support Wilson's team, stripping it of anything that might be read as self-promotion. The truth no longer needed to be hidden or embellished. It stood on its own merits. Emma's platoon returned to regular operations 3 weeks after the ambush, with Rivera back on limited duty and the rest of the men displaying the quiet confidence that comes from surviving a difficult situation together. Their reputation within the battalion had shifted, no longer defined solely by having that female lieutenant with the Silver Star, but increasingly recognized as a highly effective unit in their own right. On a crisp autumn morning, Emma was summoned to the battalion commander's office, unsure what to expect. Colonel Matthews was a career officer with a reputation for straightforward communication and zero tolerance for excuses. "Lieutenant Reese," he greeted her, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "I've been reviewing your platoon's performance over the past 3 months." Emma sat at attention. "Yes, sir. Particularly interesting is the shift in operational effectiveness since that first reconnaissance mission." He tapped a folder on his desk. "Your after-action reports show consistent improvement in execution times, mission completion rates, and tactical adaptation." "The men have performed admirably, sir." Colonel Matthews leaned back, studying her with experienced eyes. "It's more than that, Lieutenant. Your platoon has developed a cohesion that usually takes years to build. I'm curious how you've accomplished that, especially given the unique circumstances of your assignment." Emma considered her response carefully. "Honestly, sir, I stopped trying to prove anything and focused on the mission." The men responded to that authenticity. The colonel nodded slowly. "There's a leadership lesson there worth noting." He opened the folder between them. I'm assigning your platoon to lead a multinational operation in the Sangin Valley. We're coordinating with British and Afghan forces to clear a Taliban stronghold that's been disrupting coalition operations for months. Emma felt her pulse quicken. This was a significant assignment, typically reserved for more senior officers with extensive combat experience. The operation begins next week, Matthews continued. You'll be working directly with Captain James Harrison of the British SAS and Afghan National Army Commander Zahir. Full briefing tomorrow at 800. As Emma left the colonel's office, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Leading a multinational operation meant navigating not just tactical challenges, but cultural and procedural differences between allied forces. It was a vote of confidence from command and an opportunity to either validate or undermine that confidence. The briefing the next morning outlined an operation of significant complexity and importance. Intelligence had identified the Sangin Valley as a central hub for Taliban operations, with compounds serving as training facilities, weapons caches, and planning centers. The coalition force would insert at 3 points, systematically clearing the valley over a 5-day operation. Lieutenant Reese's platoon will take the central approach, Colonel Matthews explained, indicating the route on a large terrain model. British forces will secure the northern entrance, while Afghan National Army units block the southern escape routes. Captain Harrison, a weathered SAS officer with salt and pepper hair and the measured movements of a career soldier, studied Emma with unreadable eyes. Commander Zahir, his Afghan uniform crisp despite the dusty conditions of Bagram, seemed more openly skeptical of the young female officer assigned to coordinate their joint operation. After the formal briefing, Emma approached both men, extending her hand first to Zahir in recognition of Afghan cultural customs. "Commander, I look forward to coordinating our forces for this mission," she said, maintaining direct eye contact despite his initial reluctance. Zahir shook her hand with formal politeness. "Your reputation precedes you, Lieutenant. I understand you have experience in difficult extractions." The reference to her Silver Star action was unmistakable. Emma nodded once, acknowledging without elaborating. "Experience that I hope won't be necessary in this operation, Commander. Proper planning and coordination should minimize the need for heroics." This pragmatic response seemed to surprise him favorably. Captain Harrison observed the exchange with the calculating assessment of a veteran Special Forces operator. "Lieutenant," he said as she turned to him, his British accent clipped and professional, "my men will be operating in close coordination with yours. Perhaps we should discuss integration protocols before the formal planning session." "Absolutely, Captain. My platoon sergeant has extensive experience with joint operations. I'd like him included in our discussion." Over the next 3 days, Emma worked tirelessly with both allied contingents to develop an operational plan that maximized each unit's strengths while accommodating their different tactical approaches. The British SAS operated with a flexibility that contrasted with American procedural precision, while the Afghan forces brought invaluable local knowledge and language capabilities. Chun proved instrumental in bridging these differences, his previous experience with coalition operations providing practical solutions to potential friction points. Emma noted how he skillfully mediated between American standard procedures and the more adaptive approaches of their allies. "The key is understanding what's actually necessary versus what's just familiar," Chun explained during a planning session. "Sometimes we insist on doing things our way when another approach might work better in specific conditions." Emma recognized the wisdom in this perspective, implementing it throughout the planning process. Rather than imposing American tactical doctrine on their allies, she sought points of complementary strength and built the operation around them. Captain Harrison noticed this approach, commenting on it during their final coordination meeting. "Most American officers I've worked with try to run the entire show," he observed, reviewing the final operation order. Your integration of our capabilities is refreshingly effective. The mission matters more than who gets credit for it, Emma replied simply. The night before the operation, Emma visited her platoon as they conducted final equipment checks. The atmosphere was focused but relaxed, the controlled readiness of professionals preparing for complex but achievable objectives. "Lieutenant," Private Wilson called as she approached his team's position. "We were just debating whether you'd take point on the initial entry or play it by the book and stay with the command element." The question revealed much about how her leadership style was perceived. 6 months ago, they might have expected her to take unnecessary risks to prove herself. Now they were genuinely uncertain, a sign of evolving respect for her tactical judgment. "What's your assessment, Wilson?" she asked, turning the question back to him. He considered this seriously. "The central approach has the most complex terrain and highest probability of initial contact. Having command presence there makes tactical sense, but exposing the platoon leader creates command and control vulnerabilities." Emma nodded, impressed by the sophistication of his analysis. "And that's exactly the balance we need to consider. I'll be where I can best coordinate all elements while maintaining situational awareness. Sometimes that's at the front, sometimes it isn't." The operation began before dawn, with helicopter insertions placing each element at their designated start positions. Emma's platoon approached the Central Valley through a narrow ravine that provided concealment, but limited maneuver space, a calculated risk based on intelligence indicating lighter enemy presence in this sector. The first phase proceeded exactly as planned. American, British, and Afghan forces moved with coordinated precision, securing their initial objectives with minimal resistance. Emma maintained constant communication with both allied commanders, adjusting timelines as needed to ensure synchronized movement. By mid-afternoon of the first day, her platoon had cleared 3 compounds, discovering significant weapons caches, but encountering only token resistance. The relative ease of their advance triggered Emma's tactical caution. "This doesn't feel right," she commented to Chun as they secured a small compound that intelligence had indicated would be heavily defended. "Either our intel was completely wrong, or they've withdrawn to concentrate somewhere else." Chun surveyed the abandoned fighting positions that surrounded the compound recently used, but hastily evacuated. "They knew we were coming." Again, Emma immediately contacted both allied commanders, sharing her concern about the lack of resistance and suggesting a possible ambush scenario. "We're experiencing the same," Captain Harrison confirmed. "Prepared positions abandoned within the last 24 to 48 hours. Feels like they're drawing us deeper." Commander Zahir's assessment aligned with this evaluation. "My local sources suggest unusual movement toward the center of the valley. They may be consolidating for a defensive stand rather than fighting for each compound." Emma studied her tactical map, identifying potential concentration points where the terrain would favor defenders. One location stood out, a cluster of compounds situated on higher ground with excellent fields of fire covering likely approach routes. "I recommend we adjust our tempo," she suggested to both commanders. "Slow our advance and increase reconnaissance before committing to the next phase. If they are preparing a concentrated defense, rushing in plays to their advantage." The adjustment proved prescient. Advanced reconnaissance elements identified substantial enemy forces establishing defensive positions exactly where Emma had predicted. Instead of walking into a potential ambush, the coalition forces now held the initiative, able to plan their approach with full awareness of enemy dispositions. Colonel Matthews, monitoring the operation from Bagram, approved Emma's recommendation to modify the original timeline, allowing for a more deliberate approach to the enemy's main position. Harrison and Zahir both specifically endorsed your tactical assessment, the colonel informed her during an update briefing. "That's not common, Lieutenant. Coalition operations usually involve more disagreement than cooperation." The revised plan called for a coordinated approach from multiple directions, with Emma's platoon maintaining pressure from the center, while British and Afghan forces maneuvered to flank positions. Air support would be called in selectively, targeting identified command positions and heavy weapons. As they prepared to execute this adjusted plan on the morning of the third day, Emma gathered her squad leaders for a final briefing. The gravity of what they faced was clear to everyone. Intelligence now estimated 608 Taliban fighters in well-prepared defensive positions, representing the largest concentrated force they had encountered in months. "We're facing an enemy that chose this ground and has prepared it to their advantage," Emma told them, her tone matter-of-fact rather than dramatic. "But they're expecting us to follow predictable patterns of assault. Our advantage lies in disciplined execution of an approach they haven't anticipated." The operation began with precision artillery strikes on identified Taliban heavy weapons positions, followed by coordinated movement from all three coalition elements. Emma's platoon advanced methodically, using micro-terrain features for concealment that aerial surveillance might have missed, but that Chun's experienced eye had identified during planning. Initial contact came exactly where they had predicted, but the Taliban's prepared defense quickly revealed a sophisticated understanding of coalition tactics. Enemy fighters maintained disciplined fire, targeting American communications specialists and equipment, rather than pursuing maximum casualties. "They're trying to degrade our command and control," Emma realized, watching as the Taliban concentrated fire on any soldier who appeared to be using communications equipment. "Pass the word. Conceal all comms activity. Use hand signals whenever possible." This tactical adjustment prevented the enemy from identifying leadership targets, allowing Emma's platoon to maintain coordination despite increasingly heavy fire. When Specialist Miller's communications equipment was damaged by enemy fire, Emma implemented contingency procedures that maintained their connection to Allied forces through redundant systems. The battle intensified as coalition forces pressed their advantage. British SAS elements successfully flanked the northern edge of the Taliban position, while Afghan forces provided crucial intelligence about fighter movements within the compound complex. Emma's platoon maintained steady pressure from the center, preventing the enemy from concentrating against either flanking force. 4 hours into the engagement, a critical moment arose when Taliban fighters attempted to withdraw to secondary positions, recognizing their primary defense was compromised. Emma immediately coordinated with both Allied commanders to cut off this retreat. "Harrison, can your team interdict their eastern withdrawal route?" she requested over the secure channel. "Already moving," came the British captain's terse reply. "Zahir, we need your forces to secure the southern exit." "In position, Lieutenant." Emma then redirected 2 of her squads to block the remaining escape route, effectively surrounding the Taliban force. Rather than ordering an immediate assault on the trapped fighters, she implemented a controlled tightening of the perimeter, minimizing friendly casualties while offering the surrounded enemy an opportunity to surrender. This measured approach yielded unexpected results. After a brief but intense exchange of fire, white flags appeared at several points in the Taliban position. 15 fighters surrendered immediately, providing valuable intelligence about the remaining force structure and the location of their leadership. Using this information, Emma coordinated a precise airstrike on the Central Command compound, followed by a coordinated final assault that secured the entire complex with minimal additional casualties. By nightfall, the coalition force had captured the primary objective, along with 23 prisoners and extensive intelligence materials. During the after-action review, Colonel Matthews made a point of highlighting the effectiveness of Emma's tactical adjustments and coordination with Allied forces. The original operation was planned for 5 days with projected coalition casualties in the double digits, he noted. Lieutenant Reese's platoon, working in seamless coordination with our allies, completed the primary objective in 3 days, with only 7 wounded and 0 fatalities across all forces. Captain Harrison, not given to excessive praise, added his own assessment. Lieutenant Reese demonstrated a tactical flexibility that allowed for effective integration of disparate forces. The result was an operation greater than the sum of its parts. Commander Zahir, initially the most skeptical of Emma's leadership, offered perhaps the most meaningful endorsement. "My men have asked to work with Lieutenant Reese's platoon again in future operations. They say she fights with both courage and wisdom, a rare combination." As the coalition forces processed captured materials and prisoners, Emma took a moment to check on her wounded men, all of whom had sustained non-life-threatening injuries. Private Wilson, sporting a bandage on his forearm where a bullet had grazed him, grinned as she approached. "Just trying to collect some scars like yours, ma'am," he joked, referencing the now famous injuries she'd sustained in the Korengal Valley. "One is enough, Wilson," Emma replied with a slight smile. "Save some war stories for your next deployment." The successful Sangin Valley operation transformed Emma's professional standing within the battalion and the broader coalition force. What had begun as the female lieutenant with the Silver Star had evolved into Lieutenant Reese, the officer you wanted coordinating complex operations. 2 weeks later, as her platoon prepared for another mission, Emma received unexpected orders to report to division headquarters. Colonel Matthews offered no explanation beyond a cryptic, "They're interested in your experience with multinational operations." The division commander, Brigadier General Harris, was direct and to the point. "Lieutenant, I'm forming a special advisory team to improve coalition tactical integration. Your performance in the Sangin Valley operation has been highlighted by both British and Afghan commands as exemplary. I want you on this team." Emma processed this with measured professionalism. "I'm honored, sir, but my platoon will continue their excellent performance under Sergeant Chun's leadership until a suitable replacement officer is assigned," the general finished. "This isn't optional, Lieutenant. Your experience has value beyond a single platoon." The assignment represented a significant career opportunity, the kind that accelerated promising officers toward early promotion and increased responsibility. It also meant leaving the men she had led through increasingly challenging operations, just as they had formed into a truly cohesive unit. When Emma returned to inform her platoon of the reassignment, she struggled to find the right words. These men had moved from skepticism to respect to genuine trust over their months together. Leaving them felt like abandoning family. "Division is forming a coalition advisory team, and I've been selected," she explained during a platoon meeting, keeping her tone professional despite her mixed emotions. "Sergeant Chun will assume platoon leadership until a replacement officer arrives." The reactions ranged from disappointment to pride, but it was Wilson who asked the question others were thinking. "Is this because of what happened in the Korengal, ma'am? Are they still using you as some kind of symbol?" Emma appreciated his directness. "No, Private. This is because of what we accomplished together in Sangin Valley. Our integration with British and Afghan forces set a standard they want to replicate across the division." Chun, ever the professional, simply nodded his acknowledgement of the increased responsibility. "When do you report to division, ma'am?" 48 hours. We have 2 days to ensure smooth transition." Those 2 days passed in a blur of operational handovers, equipment inventories, and the countless administrative details that underpin military operations. Throughout this process, Emma was struck by how thoroughly her platoon had internalized her leadership standards. They didn't need her constant presence anymore. They had incorporated her emphasis on adaptability, precision, and tactical innovation into their unit identity. On her final evening with the platoon, they gathered informally in the recreation area. No speeches were made, no elaborate farewells offered. These were Rangers' emotional displays weren't their style. Instead, Sergeant Chun presented her with a platoon patch that had been modified to include a small silver star in one corner. "The men wanted you to have this," he said simply, "so you remember who you led before you became a staff officer." Emma accepted the patch with the gravity it deserved. I'm not sure I led you as much as you allowed me to point in a general direction while you figured out the best way to get there." This earned appreciative chuckles from the gathered soldiers. Shun shook his head slightly. "With respect, ma'am, that's what good leadership looks like. Knowing when to direct and when to trust your people to execute." As the gathering dispersed and the men returned to their quarters or duties, Private Wilson lingered briefly. "Lieutenant," he said, uncharacteristically hesitant, "when I twisted my ankle on that first patrol, most officers I've served under would have used that to prove something. Either pushing me too hard to show toughness or babying me to show compassion." Emma waited, sensing he had more to say. "You just made the right tactical decision, treating me like a soldier instead of a problem or a project." Wilson straightened slightly. "That's when I knew you were the real deal. Not because of the Silver Star or carrying Rodriguez. Because you saw me as a ranger first, not a test case for your leadership." His words captured something essential about the journey Emma had traveled from trying to prove herself worthy of command to simply exercising command effectively. The distinction seemed obvious in retrospect, but it had required months of experience and the scars to prove it. The next morning, as Emma prepared to depart for division headquarters, she found Captain Harrison waiting beside the transport vehicle. "Lieutenant," he greeted her with typical British understatement. "I understand we'll be colleagues on this advisory team." Emma smiled slightly. "They recruited you too?" Apparently our cooperation in Sangin Valley impressed someone important. His usually stoic expression softened marginally. "Though I suspect they were more impressed with an American officer who didn't insist on doing everything the American way." As they traveled to division headquarters, Harrison shared his perspective on multinational operations, drawn from years of experience with coalition forces around the world. "The most common failure point isn't tactical disagreement," he explained. "It's ego. Officers who can't separate their personal pride from operational requirements." Emma nodded. "I learned that lesson in the Korengal Valley. When your primary concern becomes how your decisions reflect on you rather than how they affect the mission and your soldiers, you've already failed." Harrison studied her with renewed interest. "Most officers take years to understand that, if they ever do. What accelerated your education?" Emma thought about the scars that mapped her body, each one representing a moment when she had chosen her soldiers' welfare over her own safety or career advancement. "Experience," she answered simply. "The kind you can't get from training or simulations." As their vehicle approached division headquarters, Emma felt a momentary apprehension about this new assignment. She had proven herself as a platoon leader, but staff work at division level represented an entirely different challenge. Would the lessons learned in combat translate to the strategic coordination of multinational forces? Harrison seemed to sense her thoughts. "They didn't select you for this team because of a medal, Lieutenant. They selected you because you demonstrated something rare, the ability to adapt military doctrine to operational reality while maintaining effective command." Emma appreciated his candor. "Let's hope that's enough." "It will be," Harrison replied with unexpected certainty. "Because unlike many officers I've served with, you understand that leadership isn't about you. It's about the mission and the soldiers who execute it." As they arrived at headquarters, Emma carried with her not just the visible and invisible scars of her combat experience, but the hard-won wisdom they represented. Each challenge had transformed her, stripping away pretense and leaving behind a leader who understood that true strength came not from proving oneself, but from empowering others. 18 months into her assignment with the Coalition Advisory Team, Lieutenant Emma Reese stood before a gathering of senior officers from 12 different nations at NATO headquarters in Brussels. The room represented centuries of combined military experience, with battle-hardened commanders from American, British, French, German, and other allied forces waiting for her presentation. Integration failure remains the primary cause of coalition casualties in asymmetric warfare environments, Emma began. her voice steady despite the gravity of her audience. Our team has identified 3 critical points where procedural differences between allied forces create tactical vulnerabilities that adaptive enemies consistently exploit. What had begun as a temporary assignment had evolved into something far more significant. Emma's experiences in Afghanistan, both the failures and successes, have provided invaluable insights into how multinational forces could operate more effectively against insurgent threats. The advisory team had expanded from its original focus on tactical coordination to address strategic integration, challenges across the entire NATO alliance. As Emma guided these senior officers through the findings and recommendations that her team had developed, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scars she had accumulated in the Korengal Valley now served as credentials more powerful than any medal or commendation. They represented lived experience that transcended theoretical doctrine. Lieutenant Reese doesn't just present concepts. Captain Harrison had told Brigadier General Harris during their quarterly review. She embodies them. When she speaks about the cost of communication failures in joint operations, commanders listen because they can see in her eyes that she's paid that price personally. After her presentation concluded, German Colonel Weber approached her during the brief recess. "Your recommendations on tactical communication protocols are particularly valuable," he said, his English precise and formal. "We experienced similar integration challenges during joint operations in Mali last year." Emma nodded, recognizing both the professional acknowledgement and the subtle indication that the German forces had encountered their own versions of the difficulties she had documented. "The common thread in almost every failure point is improvised communication when standard channels break down," she replied. "Our tendency to resort to national procedures during crisis moments creates cascading confusion." Weber studied her with the calculating assessment common to career officers. "You speak from experience, not theory." "I do," Emma acknowledged simply. As the conference continued, similar exchanges occurred with officers from various NATO contingents. Their perspectives varied based on national military traditions and doctrines, but the underlying recognition was consistent. Emma's insights carried the unmistakable weight of battlefield truth rather than staff college theory. Later that evening, at a formal reception hosted by NATO leadership, Emma found herself engaged in conversation with Major General Eleanor Patterson, one of the few female flag officers in the American contingent. "Your work has attracted attention at the Pentagon," Patterson noted, her tone carefully neutral. "There's discussion about expanding your advisory role to include training development for coalition force preparation." Emma maintained her professional composure despite the significant career implications. "I'm honored by the consideration, ma'am." Patterson's subtle smile suggested she recognized the measured response. "You've come a long way from being the lieutenant whose medical report contradicted her after-action submission." The reference to Emma's early attempt to hide her injuries caught her off guard. "You're familiar with that incident, ma'am." "I make it my business to know the full story behind promising officers, Lieutenant," Patterson replied. "Especially female officers whose careers suddenly accelerate after unusual circumstances." The general guided Emma to a quieter corner of the reception, away from the mingling officers. "When your Silver Star recommendation crossed my desk, I did some digging. What interested me wasn't the heroism as impressive as carrying a wounded soldier 8 kilometers might be. It was your initial decision to conceal those actions in your official report." Emma felt a familiar tension. Even now, with her reputation firmly established, her early choices remained part of her professional identity. "I believed at the time that I was protecting something larger than myself, ma'am." "You were protecting other women in combat roles," Patterson stated rather than asked. "Taking a personal fall to prevent your actions from being weaponized against an entire demographic." "Yes, ma'am." Patterson studied her with eyes that had navigated decades of institutional barriers. "That's why I advocated for your advisory position. Not because of what you did in the Korengal Valley, but because you understand that leadership sometimes requires sacrificing personal advancement for the greater mission. The conversation shifted Emma's perspective on her current role. What had begun as an assignment away from direct combat leadership had evolved into an opportunity to influence how coalition forces would operate for years to come. Her experiences, both the heroic moments and the painful lessons, were being transformed into doctrine that would save lives across multiple nations' armed forces. 3 days later, as the NATO conference concluded, Emma received orders that would again redirect her career path. She was being promoted to captain and assigned to the United States Military Academy at West Point as a tactical officer, responsible for cadet development. "It's not a combat posting," Brigadier General Harris acknowledged when delivering the news. "But it may be more important. You'll be shaping the next generation of officers before they develop bad habits or narrow perspectives." Emma accepted the assignment with mixed emotions. Part of her still craved the direct leadership of troops in the field, but she recognized the strategic value of influencing officer development at its source. "Your experience offers something unique for cadets," Harris continued, "particularly female cadets who still face skepticism about their capacity for combat leadership. You're not just a Silver Star recipient, you're living proof that the system can recognize merit, regardless of gender, if performance demands it." 2 months later, Emma stood before her first group of cadets at West Point, the fresh-faced, young men and women who snapped to attention at her arrival represented the future of the Army she had served through combat, injury, and institutional challenges. "At ease," she instructed, taking measure of these officer candidates with the experienced eye of someone who had led troops under fire. "My name is Captain Emma Reese. For the next year, my job is to help transform you from individuals with potential into officers capable of leading America's sons and daughters in the defense of our nation." She noticed their eyes tracking to the Silver Star ribbon on her uniform, the visible symbol of combat valor that inevitably shaped first impressions. Rather than ignoring this focus, Emma decided to address it directly. "Yes, I've seen combat. Yes, I've been decorated for actions in Afghanistan. But the medal represents the least important lessons I have to share with you." She paced slowly before their formation. The most valuable lessons came from mistakes, failures, and the painful process of learning what leadership actually means versus what we imagine it to be. Over the following weeks, Emma developed a training approach that balanced traditional military discipline with practical insights drawn from her battlefield experience. She emphasized adaptability, ethical decision-making under pressure, and the critical importance of genuine leadership versus mere authority. One afternoon, she overheard a conversation between 2 male cadets that captured the evolving perception of her role. "Reese is different from the other tactical officers," the first cadet observed. "She doesn't just quote the manual at us." "That's because she's actually done it," his companion replied. "My brother served with her platoon in Afghanistan. Said she was the real deal, not just someone with a lucky moment that earned a medal." Emma found both satisfaction and humility in this assessment. The lucky moment had nearly cost her life and left permanent scars, but the recognition that her leadership transcended that single event represented genuine progress in how female officers were evaluated. During her second semester at West Point, Emma was approached by Cadet Sarah Collins, one of the most promising members of her company. Collins had consistently demonstrated superior tactical aptitude and physical performance, but struggled with the institutional aspects of military service. "Captain Reese, may I speak with you?" Collins requested during designated mentoring hours. "Of course, Cadet." Collins hesitated, clearly struggling with how to frame her concern. "Ma'am, I'm considering withdrawing from the academy." Emma kept her expression neutral despite her surprise. Collins was ranked near the top of her class in most performance metrics. "That's a significant decision, Cadet. May I ask what's driving it?" "I keep hearing that women get special treatment in tactical evaluations," Collins said, her frustration evident. That standards are lowered so the Academy can show progress on gender integration. No matter how well I perform, there's always someone suggesting it's because requirements were adjusted. Emma recognized the familiar struggle, the corrosive impact of having accomplishments dismissed or questioned, based on gender rather than performance. She considered various responses before choosing the path of personal experience rather than institutional platitudes. "Follow me, cadet," she instructed, leading Collins from her office toward the Academy's medical facility. "Ma'am?" Collins questioned, clearly confused by this unexpected direction. "There's something I want to show you." At the medical center, Emma spoke briefly with the duty physician, a major who had served with her on the coalition advisory team. With his approval, they entered an examination room. "I'm going to show you something that isn't in my official biography or the Silver Star citation," Emma said, removing her uniform jacket. "Something that answers the question of standards and expectations more clearly than any policy discussion." She rolled up her sleeve and then lifted the back of her undershirt, just enough to reveal the network of scars that mapped her sacrifice in the Korengal Valley, the jagged line where shrapnel had torn through her shoulder, the burn marks on her arms from pulling soldiers from the burning Humvee, the web of healed lacerations from dragging Rodriguez across rocky terrain. "These weren't earned by meeting reduced standards, cadet," Emma stated quietly. "They were earned doing exactly what any officer is expected to do, placing the mission and their soldiers above personal safety." Collins stared at the visible evidence of Emma's sacrifice, her expression shifting from surprise to understanding. "The Army doesn't need female officers who meet adjusted standards," Emma continued, replacing her uniform. "It needs officers who can lead effectively, make sound decisions under pressure, and accomplish the mission regardless of circumstances. Gender becomes irrelevant when performance speaks for itself." As they walked back to the cadet area, Collins processed what she had seen. "Did you ever consider quitting, ma'am?" When the doubts seemed overwhelming. Emma considered this honestly. "After the Korengal, when Major Hayes tried to use my injuries as evidence that women couldn't handle combat. Yes, I considered whether the institution was worth fighting for." She paused before adding, "But then I realized it wasn't about the institution. It was about the soldiers who deserved the best possible leadership, regardless of where it came from." This conversation marked a turning point, not just for Cadet Collins, but for Emma's approach to her role at West Point. She began incorporating more of her personal experiences, both successes and failures, into her instruction, recognizing that authentic leadership development required honesty about the challenges officers would face, both operational and institutional. When Brigadier General Harris visited West Point for a formal review 6 months later, he requested a private meeting with Emma to discuss her progress. "Your cadets are developing a reputation," he noted, reviewing performance metrics from recent training exercises. "They're demonstrating exceptional adaptability and decision-making under pressure." "Thank you, sir. They're good officer candidates with strong potential." Harris set aside the performance reports. "That's not what interests me most. What I find compelling is the feedback from their summer training with active duty units. Commanders report that your cadets demonstrate unusual maturity in how they approach leadership challenges." Emma nodded, recognizing the character development that had become her primary focus. "Technical skills and tactical knowledge are important, sir, but we've emphasized that leadership ultimately comes down to people understanding their capabilities, earning their trust, and making decisions that balance mission requirements with soldier welfare. This perspective is particularly valuable coming from an officer with your combat record," Harris observed. "When you tell them that leadership isn't about proving oneself, but about enabling others, it carries weight that theoretical instruction can't match." As her initial year at West Point concluded, Emma received notification that her assignment was being extended for a second year, with expanded responsibilities for developing tactical training scenarios that incorporated coalition force integration. The extension included promotion consideration to major, an acceleration of her career timeline that reflected her impact on cadet development. Your approach merits broader application, the notification from Personnel Command stated. Consider developing a formal curriculum based on your experiences for potential implementation across ROTC programs and officer candidate schools. This validation of her methods represented more than personal advancement. It signified institutional recognition that the lessons Emma had learned through combat, injury, and recovery had value beyond her individual career path. The experiences that Major Hayes had once tried to use against her were now being embraced as valuable teaching tools for developing more effective officers. On the anniversary of the Korengal Valley incident, Emma received an unexpected email from Dr. Carolyn Winters, the physician who had documented her injuries when she first returned from Afghanistan. "Captain Reese," the message began, "you might not remember me, but I've followed your career since examining you after your first deployment. I wanted you to know that your case has become part of our training for military medical personnel, specifically how to recognize when service members might be concealing injuries due to concerns about perception rather than medical necessity. Your experience has helped us develop protocols that better serve all soldiers, particularly those who feel institutional pressure to minimize health concerns. The scars you earned weren't just on your body, they've left a positive mark on how we approach military medicine." The message reinforced Emma's growing understanding of how individual actions could ripple through institutions, creating change that extended far beyond personal circumstances. What had begun as her private battle to be judged by the same standards as her male counterparts had evolved into systemic improvements that benefited all service members. As her second year at West Point progressed, Emma was asked to participate in a congressional panel addressing gender integration in combat specialties. The invitation placed her in a delicate position, balancing her commitment to military protocol with the opportunity to influence policy based on lived experience rather than theoretical projections. With approval from her chain of command, Emma testified before the Armed Services Committee, providing measured, fact-based assessments of the challenges and opportunities presented by full gender integration in combat roles. "In my experience, both as a platoon leader in direct combat and as an instructor developing future officers," she stated, "the relevant factors for combat effectiveness are not demographic characteristics, but individual capabilities, unit cohesion, and leadership quality. When these elements are properly developed and supported, gender becomes irrelevant to operational success." Her testimony drew attention from both military and civilian leadership, with several committee members noting the powerful contrast between her measured assessment and the emotional arguments that often dominated such discussions. "Captain Reese offers something unique to this conversation," observed the committee chair. "Experience that transcends theory, with the scars to prove it." Following her congressional testimony, Emma received a handwritten note from Major General Patterson. "Your testimony accomplished what 1,000 policy papers couldn't, providing ground truth from someone who has actually lived it. This is the leadership I hoped to see when I supported your advisory assignment. Well done." As Emma approached the completion of her West Point assignment, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a lieutenant trying to prove herself worthy of command to a captain helping shape the future of the institution. The scars that mapped her body had become teaching tools, their stories providing lessons more powerful than any training manual. During the graduation ceremony for the cadets she had guided through their West Point experience, Emma watched with pride as Collins, now cadet, Captain Collins, led her company across the parade field with confidence that came from genuine capability, rather than institutional accommodation. After the ceremony, as new lieutenants celebrated with family and friends, Collins sought out Emma for a final conversation before departing for her first assignment. "Captain Reese," she began, standing at attention despite the festive atmosphere, "I wanted to thank you before leaving. "At ease, Lieutenant," Emma replied, noting the new rank with appropriate recognition. "You've earned your commission through hard work and demonstrated leadership. The credit belongs to you." Collins relaxed slightly. "Maybe so, ma'am, but without your guidance. That day you showed me your scars changed everything for me. Not just because they proved what was possible, but because they showed what leadership actually costs." Emma nodded, understanding the deeper lesson that Collins had absorbed. "The uniform covers the scars, Lieutenant, but they inform every decision we make. The key is ensuring they make us more effective leaders, not bitter ones." "I've been assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment," Collins added, unable to completely hide her pride at the prestigious assignment. "First female officer in my training cohort to receive that posting." "They're lucky to have you," Emma replied sincerely. "Remember what we've discussed. Your job isn't to prove women belong in the Rangers. Your job is to be an effective Ranger officer who happens to be female. The distinction matters." As Collins departed to rejoin her celebrating classmates, Emma felt the completion of a circle that had begun in the dust and blood of Afghanistan. The lieutenant who had once hidden her injuries to protect other women from institutional bias had helped develop a new officer who understood that genuine equality came not from special accommodation but from undeniable performance. Later that evening, Emma received notification of her next assignment: command of a company in the same Ranger battalion where she had served as a platoon leader, with deployment orders to follow within 6 months. The institutional recognition represented by this prime command assignment reflected how much had changed since Major Hayes had questioned her capacity for combat leadership. As she packed her office at West Point, Emma came across the modified platoon patch that Sergeant Chen had given her when she left for division headquarters, the Ranger tab with the small silver star carefully stitched into one corner. She pinned it to the inside of her uniform jacket, a private reminder of the men who had followed her into combat and the lessons they had taught her about genuine leadership. The scars that mapped Emma's body had long since healed into pale reminders of the price she had paid in the Korengal Valley. But their true value lay in the invisible changes they had created in her approach to leadership, in institutional perceptions of female combat officers, and in the development of cadets who would carry those lessons into their own commands. Emma Reese had entered the Army determined to prove herself equal to any male officer. She had emerged understanding that true leadership transcended gender entirely, focusing instead on the timeless principles that enabled soldiers to accomplish difficult missions under impossible circumstances. The path had cost her physically, leaving permanent marks that would never fully fade. But those scars had transformed from potential career liabilities into her most powerful teaching tools, visible evidence that leadership wasn't about personal heroics but about placing mission and soldiers above self. As she prepared to take command of her Ranger company, Emma reflected on the journey from that desperate day in Afghanistan to her current position. The lieutenant who had carried Rodriguez through enemy territory with broken ribs had become a captain whose example would influence officer development for generations. The scars that Major Hayes had tried to use as evidence of feminine weakness had instead become testament to the universal requirements of combat: leadership, courage, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to those under one's command. The truth of her experience had proven more powerful than any artificial standard, any institutional bias, or any predetermined limitation. In the end, performance had rendered all other considerations irrelevant, just as she had always believed it would. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.